Good morning. I just would like to welcome here today for the opening of the Global Landscape Forum here, the investment case. So welcome everybody here to Luxembourg. We're very pleased to see so many of you on a Saturday morning. I said it just to the organizers. When the idea was brought up to do this year on a Saturday in Luxembourg, for me living in Luxembourg, I thought that was very ambitious, so I'm extremely pleased to see so many. My name is Martin Berg. I'm working at the European Investment Bank, the EU's bank, which is literally just across here of the street. Some of you may have been last night at our reception at the bank, so we're quite active in investments around global landscape. Today, my role here will be as the master of the ceremony. I'll also moderate a few plenaries, and I really look forward to spending most of the day with you. We have, you've probably seen the GLF team has been reaching out with many online campaigns over the last weeks. I think a lot of interest has been created here. There are a lot of online stories. We're expecting today here over 400 people. We're expecting several thousand people online. I think in particular at the moment we can welcome participants from Asia. We're hoping that throughout the day there will be others joining, and probably for the afternoon session we will also have some of the US-based participants. The topic today is really how can we mainstream sustainable finance, in particular for global landscapes. For me, working for the European Investment Bank, that's one of the critical questions. But before we're actually going into the first plenary, I've been asked to provide a few logistical information. So there's a Wi-Fi network here. It's called GLF Luxembourg, and the password is Think Landscape. If you have problems connecting, there are many colleagues here from the Global Landscape Forum that can help. You are encouraged to share all your experiences via social media. I think the two hashtags are @ThinkLandscape and @GLF Luxembourg 2019. There's some translation provided in this plenary, so you can retrieve your devices outside if that's necessary. Throughout the day, we will have a few announcements. Just listen to them in the case they're the changes to the program. The program will take place here for the plenary sessions, but we will also have, as you can see in the, from the program, we have several breakout groups, and we will explain how you can find the other rooms. Just to reassure everybody, all the food and beverages that is being provided here is vegetarian, and the lunch will take place just outside here where you hopefully had a chance to get a coffee. It is possible to engage here, and we're actually using a system called Slido. Some of you may know this, and maybe we could get the information of this Slido system up so that people can use it. If you just type in your smartphone www.sly.do, then you will be able to actually enter this. And what we try to do is we try to make it as interactive as possible, so you can provide comments there. There will be a couple of polls, and I thought before kind of starting with the first plenary, perhaps we can test the system a little bit. So maybe we can just go through a few kind of questions that we're all sure how it works. The first one is, and maybe you should be able to see it now in your system. How energized are you feeling right now? And if you could just type between 1 and 10, and then we should be able to see the result. I hope that's working. Oh, very good. So, lots of energy in the room. Thank you very much. And what we're trying to do now is to show you also a little bit the different ways, what different type of polls we can do. Next one is, can you just type in where you're coming in from today? Could we go to the next slider? Could you put up the next question so that we can see how to test the system? Is that possible? So, thank you. So I think here you can just type in, perfect, works, where you're coming from, and we'll see a little bit. So we already see a little bit Luxembourg dominating. Obviously, that's something we expected. Netherlands, very good. Germany. Thank you. And then, just as said, to see what is possible, can we have the next question, which is more like a poll where you have to choose from a few questions. And we're starting very easy today. So the question there is why you're participating today. Perhaps we could get up that next question, the next slide or question up on the screen. Perfect. Could you get the next slide or question up? Would that be possible? Just so that we are testing the system. Thank you. So there you can see, and we will use this throughout the day, that we use one of the three. So here you have a few, you have to choose from a few options. So one is to learn more about landscape financing, to be inspired by good discussions, to network with interesting participants, or I just don't know. So, well, I hope we can convince those that don't know that it was worthwhile to come. But I'm actually pleased to see that people really want to learn something, because I think about landscape planning, because that's a perfect transition to our first plenary. So if I could ask the participants of the first plenary just to come up here to the stage. So our first plenary, we really focus on the key question, at least in my mind, of today. How can we move sustainable land use financing into the mainstream? But before we actually start, hopefully a very lively discussion, what I would like is to ask Minister Karel Dieschberg to come up here and to provide us with a welcome. In Luxembourg, Karel Dieschberg doesn't need any introduction, but perhaps for those that come from outside, Karel Dieschberg has been elected for the Minister of the Environment in 2013, and was actually re-elected in 2018, and actually now enlarged even her portfolio, and also including for sustainable development. She's been a champion not only on environmental questions in Luxembourg, but also in particular on climate change, was participating in the 2015 COP in Paris and played a leading role, given that the presidency at that point was at Luxembourg. So we're really, and she's also a very big supporter, working, for example, with the European Investment Bank to spur really investment in this area. So we're really happy to have you here, and I would like to ask you to come up. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin Berg, for this lovely introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be here with you on this Saturday morning, and I would like to welcome you very warmly, because on a Saturday, spending the day here in order to learn about sustainable finance, this needs an applause for you. So thank you. So it's an honor to be with you and to talk the most important issue: how to give hope to people, how to be enabler of the future and be actors of change, because that's what we have to do together. And I would like to congratulate the Center for International Forestry Research and UNOP for having put together this interesting program about how to move to sustainable land use financing and do this in the mainstream. Because this is the question: how do we accelerate the transition? And I may start with a quote from Vandana Shiva, who told us that it's not an investment if you destroy the planet. And I think this is the thinking that we have to put through, to have good reasons to invest in the planet, in people, in peace, in security, because this is what it's all about. We are facing huge crises at the moment that are closely linked. The climate crisis, crisis of biodiversity loss, land degradation. Our forests are burning and we are highly polluting. So we're not efficient at all in what we do at the moment. The question is not if we move. The question we are facing is if we are able to move quick enough, if we are able to move together and create the right alliances of the willing, for instance. Alliances of those people who take a holistic approach in order to integrate sustainability into financing systems, into economics. Because you can't deal with the planning, dying species, you can't deal with climate, but you can deal with people, you can change economic systems. And it's a question about building the bridges, analyzing the gaps of the system. Yesterday, Luxembourg agreed on a new climate law, the first climate law, and we decided to go for climate neutrality at the latest in 2050. We also decided to increase our efforts, going from 40% reduction target to 2005 to 55% of reductions until 2030, which tells that we are taking into account the climate urgency and that we are serious about scaling up what we do. And therefore, we need the finance sector. We have a huge finance sector here in Luxembourg. We need economics, but we also need all consumers, because we have to change everything. We have to change, to reconnect with nature and with people, because this is the biggest challenge that we face. We also have put some principle in the law. For instance, that we have a holistic approach if it comes to climate change. Solutions are only solutions if we integrate environmental integrity, climate justice, no backsliding, forward-looking. If we do not make options for false solutions, for instance, nuclear, if we preserve biodiversity. We need to increase adaptation efforts, and there's a close link to biodiversity protection and create win-win situation. Indeed, forests, wetlands, seagrass meadows are important carbon sinks and help us mitigate climate change. And we need to conserve genetic diversity. The diversity is the key. It's not mainstreaming, which goes away from diversity, but mainstreaming by preserving diversity. If it comes to people, Luxembourg is a very open country with lots of different nationalities, and that's the culture that we live in. So why go away from diversity, from biodiversity, if it comes, for instance, to agriculture? Having more choices, more options, if it comes to what you eat, what you find at your table, is important. Until now, very often, there's a big disconnection between reality on the ground and money. I've been a producer before being minister, and I can tell you that we have to bridge the gaps that we see between long-term, short-term investments, so developing new instruments. There's also a gap and a difference between who gains or who's the winner of a system. Will we have big or small scale models? Will we have big or small-scale producers, because in Europe, for instance, the industry sector, if it comes to agriculture, is gaining much more from agriculture than small-scale producers. The question there, who is the winner? So we have to put forward the right question if we make investments decision. And still we have, I would say, 10 years to change this whole system. So just accelerate what we do is what we have to do. And we have to also integrate thinking from the soil, thinking from Mother Earth. Because the system we are running today, we are also disconnected from the landscapes, from the soils, and very often we do not firstly think about nature-based solutions, but we have those solutions, and they are already there. The question is, how fast will we be in making those nature-based solutions, through cost accounting, carrying capacities, all those kind of things, put them into financial thinking. And this is where we have to discuss about, I think, today. And with this, I think Luxembourg has done lots of progress in order to combine climate crisis, biodiversity loss, and find solutions. We have been working during the last years together with the Finance Ministry to establish new instruments. One of the new instruments that we have put forward in Luxembourg was the EIB platform, where we have highly innovative projects and the government takes the guarantee. So we have a private leverage in those very innovative things. One of the projects is the Land Degradation and Neutrality Fund, a fund that supports land restoration and can help local farmers. One other project is the UN Red Plus program. There we are in cooperation to scale up the engagement with private and finance sector and work towards transforming agricultural production that better balances climate action with enhanced yields farm income. So the transition needs to be sustainable. We have to give opportunities to invest into the right direction. Another thing that we have been put forward was the Blue Natural Capital Financing Facility that focuses on coastal areas. So we have to put forward diverse instruments, give diverse opportunities to combine those thinkings. So now I think I made some examples. I'm looking forward for the panel discussion, looking forward to see you find with us a solution, to learn from each other. Because one thing that I have learned in my career as Environment Minister is that we have to learn to understand each other. Those coming from environmental sector, finance sector, economy. It's all about learning from each other, speaking the same language, and yes, finding the right solutions together. We as politicians have to put the right framework on, give incentives, but we also have to listen. So that's why I'll stop now, and I'm looking forward to the discussion, and thank you for listening to me.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Carol, for this perspective from Luxembourg. I would now like to ask Tim Christopherson from UN Environment to actually provide maybe more, let's say, the more international UN perspective. Tim coordinates the work of the Freshwater, Land and Climate Branch at UN Environment, including the UNEP's role in the UN RED program. So please, if you could get up and provide your perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin, and good morning, everyone. First of all, thank you very much to Luxembourg for bringing us all together, and to the Global Landscapes Forum and all the other partners. I think this is an exciting meeting of the landscape and the finance world. I'd like to start my 3 brief points with a point on the international context. We're coming on a wave of momentum There's been a climate action summit in September in New York where nature-based solutions, resilience, and the link between biodiversity and climate that the minister mentioned was front and center. So finance ministers, heads of states everywhere are paying attention. We are going into the super year for nature next year with many important conferences, a new 10-year framework for biodiversity, and after that we're going into the United Nations Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, 2021 to 2030. So all of this tells us this is the next big thing, how we solve managing our land, our natural ecosystems better. It is 23% of all emissions from the land use and forestry sector. It is the largest still untapped potential for big climate action. It is also the cause of more than 50% of terrestrial biodiversity loss. If we can tackle those two things together, it will enable all the other sustainable development goals. So you are in the right place. That's my first point. The second one is what has this to do with the world of finance? Luxembourg is in fact quite a big country, 130 banks, 4,000 funds. It is a big country in the world of finance. And in taking the example of restoration, if we want to restore 350 million hectares of degraded landscapes worldwide, it will cost roughly $800 billion, more or less. In the world of landscape and environment where many of us work, this sounds like an enormous amount, but in the world of finance, that is actually not a big amount. Even in the world of politics, it's not a big amount. Consider that governments spend about $5.2 trillion per year on fossil fuel subsidies. This includes all the direct, indirect subsidies plus the costs from climate change. This is what most of your taxpayer money goes to. So we need even less than 1 year's worth of fossil fuel subsidies to repair the worst damage we've done to nature. We need just slightly more than 1 year's worth of agriculture subsidies, which stand at $705 billion per year, and many of these subsidies cause soil erosion, biodiversity loss, and massive greenhouse gas emissions. This is what our taxpayer money goes to. So these are not big amounts we're talking about. We just need to reprogram fiscal incentives. We need to reprogram how the investment is made. And the world of finance also needs to face the possibility of a stranded assets situation with fossil fuel investments. The subprime mortgage crisis started in the same way that everybody thought this was a great idea. It actually had a good policy objective to make housing cheaper for low-income earners, but we all know how it ended. For fossil fuels, I think we have to look long-term and think about divestment, but then the question is, coming to my last point, where else to invest? There's already a lot of liquidity, there's already a lot of money looking for investments, and in our area, sustainable landscape, sustainable finance, we need to provide alternatives for these kinds of investments at large scale. Alternatives in sustainable agriculture, alternatives in forestry, and here we have to get it right with good social and environmental safeguards and key performance indicators. And we have to form new partnerships, because much of that knowledge of how to reinvest is in this room. So think of this event today like a wedding. We've been on a few first dates together with the finance and the landscape, agriculture, forestry world. And now I think we have decided to form a new alliance. So this is the wedding day, and if you, during the course of today, find somebody from the other family and talk to them, I think you will probably make the most of this day. We're in this together, all of us, so let's get this done. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you very much for this inspiring speech. So we all noted that landscape financing is the next big thing, and that actually is exactly what we try to discuss, because while that may be the expectation at the moment, is still very much a niche market, and the whole probably most of the day. We will discuss this, but in particular on the plenary question is how can we actually move it to the mainstream. But before I actually ask some of our experts, I actually want to turn back to you using the Slido, which we practiced earlier today. And perhaps we could get up the next question. And actually, I'd like to turn the question of the plenary back to you. So, what actions are most needed to mainstream sustainable finance? We give you 5 choices. Is it policy frameworks, new narratives, scaling bankable projects, measuring impact, i.e. proof of concept, or other? We'll give it a bit of time to see what the results will be. Good, perfect. So, policy framework seems to be the clear leader, and I think I see both Carol Dieschberg and Tim nodding. We'll definitely drill in this there. I also see scalable bankable projects going up there. That actually brings me to our next speaker, and I'd like to turn to Jen Price, who's the president and CEO of Calvert Impact Capital. To many of you, probably also, Jen doesn't really need an introduction, but she's a real expert in actually putting real money, not only into landscape-related, but in general in impact-focused investments. And I think, given that the bankable product also scored really high on this list, so maybe we can turn to you and you can provide us a bit of a perspective how banks and investors can drive more capital into sustainable, commercial, viable agriculture, forestry, and agroforest production, and processing models that are aligned with the SDGs and the Paris Agreement.
Yeah, good morning, and thank you for that warm introduction, Martin. It's a pleasure to be here, and especially with this conversation, because as you noted, it goes to the heart of what I do day in and day out. At Calvert Impact Capital, we are working to put money to work in projects that are left behind from the traditional banking system. Banks, and it's not because they're not financeable. You know, these are projects that can be financeable, they just aren't at this present time. And so it was very interesting for me personally watching these 2 bankable projects and policy kind of intertwine at the top, because I think that's very much what I see sitting at a place, moving money into projects that are inherently financeable but are left behind from the traditional financial system, which is simply the current system, and Minister, you hinted upon this, does not really does not fit the work that we're trying to do today. We need the system to change. And easy to say, harder to do. But the reality is that system does not really look at not just financial return. It doesn't look at the impact return. It does not look at the degradation return. It does not look at these other, and I loved what you said, it is not an investment if you destroy the planet. It does not look at the planetary elements around investing. And so the system is not built for purpose. And so that's where the policy and the bankable solutions I find are very intertwined in really how do we get more mainstream money in. 3 thoughts briefly at this point that perhaps can set some more discussion for the day. But one is education. I do think that we need to educate mainstream finance about what is possible. It's painful, it takes multiple visits, but it is necessary. There is truly a disconnect between what is happening on glass towers and what is happening on the earth. And we need to merge those 2, and we all have an opportunity to do that in this room. Another is products and services. We do need to provide different types of products and services to the financial institutions. They need on-ramp. They need ease and access to enter into the type of work that's happening closer to the planet. And that does take, in a generic term, innovative finance. The third thing is actually advocacy. I'm sure everyone in this room owns assets. You have your own wealth. And you have a voice at these financial institutions to ask for change. And I have really found that that is a powerful, powerful tool as well. Perhaps one we don't think of because we're deep in the work, but we also have our own voice to ask for change from these banking relationships that we carry in our day-to-day life. The work we do at Calvert Impact Capital is we provide products and services to financial advisors, to chief investment officers of pension funds, so they can invest their assets. So again, we're providing products and on-ramps, so they can invest their clients' assets in a way that really respects both planet and people, as well as financial return. We poll our investors, and we have about 5,000 to 6,000 individual investors, institutions, individuals today in our products and services. The number one concern they have is around planet and natural landscapes. They want things to be different, and what we see is that voice going into the bank, into the financial institution, going into the gatekeeper of their assets is a really important signal to the bank to do things different. And so also I encourage you to think about the power you have in that way in making change. Many of us have our assets and we don't think about them. They're kind of sitting quietly, but take a moment to think about what you can do to activate a different conversation in that dimension.
Thank you very much, then. I think in particular, your second point caught my interest. So different types of service, different type of products, and I think this allows me to bring in Sarah Löfqvist, who's an environmental economist and PhD student in Zurich. She's also a representative of the youth program. So thank you very much for joining. She also joined on a very short notice. So thank you very much. And I understand you had a very good already pre-meeting yesterday throughout the day. So I understand, Sarah, that you're actually working on this from an academic perspective, which I personally find really interesting, because when I went to university, that was not possible. And you're looking really a little bit into what is needed now to bring landscape financing to the mainstream. But we talked a bit about it last night, a bit before. But you also see a few risks. So maybe you can describe a little bit what you are doing, and also react a little bit to Jen's points.
Yeah. So it was interesting, me and Jen just spoke about this before we started, that there is such a discrepancy behind what people like Jen are doing and behind what I have been taught in my studies. And that is one of the things we need to address. But in this entire discussion, there is a lot of focus on bankability, which of course is very, very important. And it is important from the point of view of asset managers. But coming from a scientific perspective, we also see a danger in that, because some of the restoration projects that may have the highest social or biophysical potential should maybe not be turned into a ROI-driven project. But then what do we do? So what we have done in our research is to look at a larger plethora of private actors that could be investors without the traditional ROI perspective. So we have looked into corporations, for example, who may invest because of brand value, or because of they want to boost sustainable brand image, or they want to do it as part of an in-setting strategy, which may not lead to direct ROI, but may still be hugely beneficial for a private actor. So that is the one thing. There's also, we see a huge role of the public finance and the public support to still play in these investments. Because what we hope is to have a release of private investments for restoration, but when that happens, there is a risk that the private profit objective may crowd out the social and environmental objectives. So we need, maybe with restoration more than in other asset classes, we need to have a very strong public support to, first of all, enable the investments in step one through blended finance mechanisms or through insurances against currency fluctuations, for example. But we also need to remain the public support so that we can ensure that the social and environmental objectives are still core of the projects we're doing, and that the private objectives don't crowd that out and shape landscape in a negative way, which is actually what brought us into this mess in the first place. So finally, as you said, I was invited here as a youth representative. And I do think there's a lot of hope to be seen in the fact that there is a huge youth movement for sustainability right now. We have the Friday strikes. We have Greta Thunberg, who has been a huge leader and inspiration for all of us. And I think for someone like me, I was born in the 90s, and I grew up with climate change all around. I grew up hearing the older generation speak about my generation as the generation to save the environment for. And now I'm an adult and I realize the relay stick in the race against climate change was thrown to my generation. And we will not have anyone to throw it further to. So this issue has to be solved by us. And I think all of us realize that. There is a growing interest and there's a lot of aggression, as you've seen, amongst younger people for what has happened so far. And I do see a lot of hope looking forward. There is huge challenges in upscaling finance for restoration in an equitable manner. But there are new, innovative, sustainable finance mechanisms, which is one thing, but also knowing that a younger generation is rising to positions in politics, in corporations, in banks, and that these people have a mindset with more sustainable focus than maybe the older generations have. And I hope and I think that will be a huge enabler of change as well.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Now, this gives me a good opportunity to bring in Tony Simmons into our discussion, who's the Director General of World Agroforestry, working a lot with universities, but also working with very concretely on a few investment opportunities. So I wanted to bring you in and actually that you share a bit your perspective, in particular on this whole question, how we can mainstream more and some practical examples, perhaps.
Great, thanks very much, Martin. Good morning, Luxembourg. And what a fantastic Saturday morning. Here in this temple of economic prosperity, we're talking about nature-based solutions. It's a delight to join the Luxembourg government, United Nations Environment Programme, private investors, all of the people who are trying to create greater connections between the finance world and the world of development. So 3 points. The first one on project development. We've heard about problems of too few bankable projects. We've heard about problems of one project at a time is not going to take us to scale. But do we hear about how much we're willing to invest in project development? Because we've been involved in projects where people will expect to spend $50,000 on the complete design and development phase to launch. And others who have had to spend $1 million for a $5 million project to get to that phase. So the key problem is we're either under or over investing in that project development phase and not treating it also as a portfolio. Second point is what is actually happening at the landscape level? Are we aware? In this single project at a time phase, we're unaware of these overlapping geographic landscapes, yes, but human landscapes, political landscapes, financial landscapes. And how are we going to increase that awareness? There are large private sector companies that have more knowledge about developing countries than the national governments do. They have more data, they have more analyses, they have a greater diagnosis of what is needed. And most of that information is pre-competitive, but it's not shared. So C4 ICRAF, the merger of the fantastic forestry-based institution in Indonesia, C4, and the World Agroforestry Center, ICRAF, based in Kenya, have come together to look at that entire land use space, to look at nature-based solutions, to look at value chains. Because we delude ourselves that these value chains are creating value. But most of them are actually extracting value and extracting it at the cost to the environment and to society. And so we need a landscape register. We need an inventory of things that are going on so we can reduce those project development costs, so that we look at these value chains, not as single value chains, but as interacting value chains, and actually as value webs. Because along those, there are intersections and interactions that we can address at landscape scale. Lastly, third point, on the return to risk assessments and ratios. They're highly skewed and they're partial. and we've got to change those. And we saw the greatest need was for policy change, and likely that true assessment, looking at those returns and risks against not just the financial parameters, but those social and environmental parameters. And our ESG guidelines should not be about do least harm, but to do no harm. Having said that, though, there will still be winners and losers as we intervene at the landscape level. And we've got to assess projects and look at that threshold of acceptability, because we tend to glance over that to be protected by our tick-the-box ESG guidelines. And it's interesting, when we look at our financial assets, they appreciate. That's wonderful. Our plant and buildings, we depreciate them. But land, you do neither to. And it is this land use, this landscape management of the terrestrial planet that we have, that is our big challenge. And that's where our thinking has got to change about how we can appreciate those natural assets, that natural infrastructure. Because we're not treating it like built infrastructure, we're treating it something that can be capital that can be drawn down on. Well, in many places, we're almost bankrupt. And those degraded areas that Tim spoke of were really, are hugely threatened. So on the positive side, it's great that we've got these new approaches, great new investors that are coming to the table, but we've got to do something more about it. There's got to be a business case for landscape management, a business case for landscape restoration. If we go down the conservation route, we will be tied and we will only do a fraction of it. If nature was a bank, the dividend from that bank would be 30 times bigger than the world's financial bank. Just the dividend would be 30 times the assets of the biggest bank. If nature was an economy, it would be 1.5 times our global economy in GDP terms. And so can we afford to ignore that? Can we afford not to do the right things that will help youth and prosper us financially, but also leverage on the environment and build that social capital that will underpin all of those investments? Thanks for listening.
Well, thanks so much, Tony. I think there's a lot to unpack there, and particularly like the analogy in the way we're treating, let's say, our built infrastructures versus we're treating the green infrastructure. And I'm coming from an institution that's very much engineering driven, and it is striking because no engineer would treat built infrastructure in the same way we're treating our green infrastructure. And if we had a real plan, as you kind of suggesting it, we would probably look at it very differently, and also we would value it completely differently. Now, you mentioned another thing, which is policy change, which brings me back to the Slido poll we had at the beginning, because that was really the number one. We kind of sidetracked a little bit, and we don't. It's in a way it's the elephant in the room, and we don't want to duck it. So Tim, can you perhaps go into this a little bit more? So what? In your mind, you heard now a little bit we had now 3 different perspectives of what's needed to really mainstream. You mentioned yourself policy change. What really needs to happen from a policy perspective?
Thank you. If I limit it to 2 points, that would be the most important changes. One, I already alluded to, fiscal policies. We have a tsunami of fiscal incentives and market signals that are pointing the other way. So the private sector by itself can stand on its head and try to do the right thing, but as long as the market and policy signals are pointing the other way, this is not going to work. So we need to reform fiscal policy. That is the number one. And I think what gives me a lot of hope is that a lot of finance ministers, including here in Luxembourg, but increasingly in other countries, are now seeing that. There's 44 finance ministers that are forming the group of climate finance ministers now organized by the World Bank. So we have arrived at the place where we can make this change that is necessary. That is the first point. The second one is to account for nature in national accounting. There's a sort of a dry place to work in New York, but a very important one called the U.N.Statistical Division, and that issues the System of National Accounting Manual. That sounds like a very dry thing, but it's actually determining how governments measure if they're doing the right thing. It gives heads of states and ministers of finance their dashboard. We have to move beyond GDP, which is a ridiculous measure for national wealth and human well-being, and include natural capital accounting, social welfare, and that is happening. It's called the System of Economic and Environmental Accounting. It's been first published in 2012 and now nearing completion. Next year, all countries will have the opportunity to measure natural capital as part of their national wealth. So that is another huge change that is needed.
Okay, well, thank you then. Carol Dischbach, maybe you could react a little bit as well, exactly to the same question. What, from your perspective, is there anything that hasn't been said that we need to address from a policy perspective?
No, I guess I fully agree. It's about really, and Luxembourg put something in this program. From next year on, we will have a sustainability check if it comes to new policy framework. So we will not only check the financial aspects if a new law is put forward, but we will check the sustainability as a whole approach. So also the effects if it comes to climate, biodiversity, social impacts. I think these are the questions that governments have to put forward. Secondly, we have to be investing the own money into the right direction, which means divesting if it comes to fund. And we have established together with the UN Environmental Financial Program a sustainable finance roadmap, and will establish a platform together with finance sector, civil society and governments. So these alliances, as I call them, so invest into the right direction, but we reoriented, for instance, part of the mobility investments in Luxembourg into public transport. We will be the first country that will have in the whole country free public transportation for everyone. So investing into another direction, public transportation, soft mobility, really getting out of what we are used to do, of the comfort zones, also in politics, having the courage to say, okay, we're going to have to change frameworks and put alternatives. And I think working in concrete alternatives, instead of fighting existing models, giving a better choice is of utmost importance. But this is not a comfortable thing to say to people. Yes, we have to have a whole toolbox, come away, and that's why the policy framework is one thing, but the narratives and the values, the discussion about what's freedom, what is a good choice, enable people, and working for capacity building is important. That's why we put forward the International Climate Finance Accelerator. I think you're right, we have to have capacity building if it comes to managers in the finance sector, but we also have to invest as governments in education. Mandela said education is the sharpest weapon to change. I fully agree. That's why I'm not only working with the finance minister, but also with education for making sustainability touchable from the youngest age, in order to make people, and I know that young people are much more aware of that they have to have a future, so that we have to have good landscapes, protect biodiversity, but really enable people to make the choice if it comes to afterwards economic actors, if it comes to the finance sector. This is important. That's why we are trying to have a whole government approach instead of having sectoral approach. And I think it's important anyway. If you come from finance sector, if you come from economic sector, and from agriculture, stepping out of your comfort zone and making the links and looking at the whole value, we are pushing a lot for circular economy. Yes, there too we have to change the economic models, because if we go for circularity, it's really having something completely else than we have at the moment. What is bankable? What are the risks? It's really about the long-term planning too, taking into account the risk if it comes to pollution, toxic elements in the products that we have at the moment. So really pushing this framework and investing into the right direction and taking people with you would be things I fully agree on. And then creating new opportunities. We also have, I didn't speak about it, but we also have created a Forestry and Climate Change Fund together with NGOs, with the government, making the de-risking, but also going in as an investor, thus encouraging, for instance, finance sector, insurance sector, to go with us in order to work for circularity in Latin America, for instance, and creating opportunities in parts of the world by acting as a de-risker, investor, and taking people with us. So basically, I think everything has been said on that, and I fully agree on that.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Caroline. I'd like to turn over to you and to see whether there are any questions for the panelists. I don't know whether there are microphones around in the room. Is this possible, or do we otherwise need to? There's a microphone. I see already a question right here in the front. Is this coming? Perhaps you could introduce yourself, so just so we know who you are, and perhaps you could also direct the question to a specific speaker.
Okay.
Thank you.
It's Alexander Pohl from HSBC. 800 billion to solve the problem. Private equity and hedge funds control 4 trillion. How do you get them, who are very heavily vested in electrification, renewable energy, the carbon markets, which are very lucrative, right? We've created an asset class, you can trade carbon, it's very lucrative. Hedge funds knows how to do that. How do you get them to care about what's effectively foundation finance? You know, the sustainable foundation is the landscape and nature. How do you get to divert those 4 billion or even 4 trillion or even just 800 billion of that into this? And I don't know who to direct that to.
Okay, no, we'll do this. This is an excellent question. This is the heart of what we're here. What's the business case here? And there are alternatives, and there are even alternatives in green investment. It's not like that we have the investment between fossil fuel and landscape. There are shades. Thank you. We'll touch this, but maybe we take 2 more questions. That we have 3. We have the gentleman here in the front.
My name is Gert-Jan Storm. I have one contribution to offer at the level of systems change, the potential to refer to scientific findings, a safe operating space for humanity, in support of the implementation of the SDGs and the climate agreement. And in concrete terms, that could be projected onto what we see as a big issue in Europe, the future of EU common agricultural policy. And for red zone issues, biodiversity, land use, climate, and the nitrogen and phosphorus cycles are a candidate to perform the role of key performance indicators in terms of reduction of risk. And I think the concept of risk could be a good bridge between what we endeavor to achieve in terms of bringing about nature-based solutions and finance, by the way. And in terms of bankable opportunities, there's a lot to go for nature-based solutions, because there's a lot to be found that lends itself to help to feed into this discussion. I refer to analysis of the Nature Conservancy about the top 10 natural climate mitigation pathways with co-benefits. It's already 2 years old. And allow me also to refer to ongoing work on mobilizing private investment, CPIC, conducted by IUCN and Cornell University. I advise IUCN. Thank you for your attention, but I just wanted to share these options to say that we can be much more concrete than we think we could be. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. You're absolutely right. There are a lot of groups that are thinking through this, and I know a lot of in the room are actually engaging or even part of that. Maybe one more question. He needs to be.
Yes, my name is Pierre Rousseau from BNP Paribas. I have one question. In order to attract investors, we need to talk about de-risking. I didn't hear about the word risk during this conversation. And I think it's probably the most important things. We talk about one side on return, and the return can be, as explained, different things than the financial return, and we agree on that. But there is a risk part, and if you want to attract investors, we need to bring risk. So I think it's something important that probably need to be involved in the conversation. The second part is transition. I think we forgot to think and to work about additionality. We work always on finality. But what we have to finance is a transition. And financing a transition, today I don't see anybody talking about it. We finance green, but we don't finance transition. So maybe we need to focus also on finding products and working on products of financing the transition and not financing the finality itself. So it will probably have a higher impact and it will probably be faster. So I'm curious to see what is your view on this, especially from the academic side, about if you make research around that, because we need research around that and we need probably additional business model to be put in place.
Well, thank you very much. No, excellent questions. I have to say, I'm in particular pleased to see that we have HSBC and BNP asking questions in the first question, because that's one of the, I think, the key things that we try to actually also achieve with this forum here, to really get the financial sector engaged in this debate. So we have three questions. First one for me is the business case. In a way. Then perhaps are there already some business cases out there that have been proven? And this is what the gentleman in the front here said. And then the other question of de-risking and transition. May I, because I'm seeing here a red 0, which is our time left, but I think we're allowed to go over a few minutes. May I also use this then maybe for your side to pick out one of the three, because I think all of you have to really have a very short closing statement and addressing at least one of the questions. And maybe we're starting this time with Tony, and we're giving the last word to Karel Diesbroek.
Thanks very much, and thanks for the interesting questions. It probably comes back to metrics. In the land use sector, we like certification, we like looking at 200 variables and trying to understand it, and we pursue that without thinking of the applicability or utility of it. So if we go to the health sector knows that there's 200 causal factors for human heart disease, 200. But 3 of them, smoking, high blood pressure, and cholesterol, account for 75% of heart attacks. So that's where they put their awareness, their investments, their interventions, their monitoring and reporting. And yet in land use and landscapes and agriculture and forestry, we go the other way, 100, 200, even 450 indicators in GRI. What are those proxy metrics that explain the health of landscape functioning, both financially, socially, and naturally? What are those things on whether it's soil organic carbon or higher plant diversity, water use efficiency, social inclusion, strength of farmer-producer organizations, the policy support, the enabling environment underneath it? We need to develop those metrics that are universal, that we can apply to any landscape, temperate, tropical, developed, large scale, small scale. Then we will know where we're making progress. Then we'll be able to relate back to your point, Pierre, about what those risks are. We have fantastic knowledge that research organizations are producing. Brilliant evidence, analyses, social technical policy solutions. The trouble is we need to turn those knowledge products into knowledge services. Project design, decision support, delivery options, risk identification management, capacity development. When we make that jump and translate those knowledge products into services, we will get success, and we'll be able to drive and make use of those metrics universally across different geographies, sectors, and interests.
Thank you, Tony. Sarah.
Yeah, so I'll address your question about risk, which is probably the main barrier in upscaling investments for a landscape. And I'll go back to the blended finance, because I think that is one of the core things we need. There is investment interest in sustainability, and we see sustainable investments going into renewable energy, for example, but they are not moving into the landscape to the same extent, because it is perceived as risky. So you could have public support going in and buffering against, this is first loss guarantee, that a public actor would take the first loss if a project would falter. There's also the possibility of having a public actor buffer against currency fluctuations or political turbulence, which is often prevalent in the countries where we need to do a restoration at the most. But then there is also a lot of innovative financial solutions, like Jen is talking about as well, like green bonds, for example. So you could, whilst an asset manager may not want to invest in a specific agroforestry project in Ghana, they may want to invest in a green bond that bundles several agroforestry projects together across different geographic regions. So I really think the public support is crucial in this, as well as new innovative financial mechanisms.
Well, thank you. Jen, perhaps for you, you're someone who deals really with the broad spectrum of,
Yes.
Of impact and also other environmental products. Maybe you can address that question on how do we make the case for landscape investment vis-a-vis other green investment? That's a really interesting question.
It is. And maybe I'll just try and connect to a few comments. Accounting is destiny. I totally believe that. And so once you measure what matters, then Tony, one of your comments earlier, building the business case, I think is crucial too, which gets to part of what you're articulating. When you see value, then you can quantify it through the accounting, and then you can bring the capital that follows. And for my closing comment, I'll just say we work across a lot of sectors at Calvert Impact Capital, and as I've been sitting here, one analogy that comes to mind is gender. 10 years ago, we were talking about it was the right thing to do to invest in women. We're now transitioned to a place with a lot of data showing that it is a business case to have diversity within corporations. Better decisions are made, better financial returns occur. And I think this goes into the core of landscapes. Once you can have the accounting that validates its value and present the business case, then the money will follow. And so I leave my comments there.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Tim, quickly combining the points on investments and risk, I wasn't suggesting this is all private money. In fact, I think drawing the parallel to the renewable energy transition, it will take a massive public finance push to get this machinery of private investments moving. And risk, Pierre, there is of course perceived and real risk, but for investors, those are both real. And one of them, perceived risk, is a function of a lack of knowledge. So in a way, we're addressing this today by bringing all of us together and giving the knowledge of what these investments could look like and lowering the perceived risks by educating ourselves on how this could work. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. And Carol, maybe the one thing that hasn't been addressed, and the question of transition. That was a question on transition. Maybe you're a good person to share your view how we should look at this.
I think it's of utmost importance to take everyone with us. So we know that we are living in a very disruptive time. So some jobs will be lost and some jobs will be created. And it's up to governments to take also responsibility. And that's something that we have been writing in our climate law, for instance, that we will also care for to leave no one behind. So to also take not only the environmental side into account, but also the social. So we need societies in transition. We need to change narrative, take into account the risks and the data that we all know, but are not taken into account. So basically environment and CO2 emissions. But we also, as politicians, have to take into account that we have to take people with us. So financing transition will be one very big discussion also in reorienting our legislation framework, in reorienting the economies. And for this reason, I think there are solutions. And we will talk on a European scale about this transition, but we have also to speak on a worldwide scale, how to take people with us, show the opportunities, and then going in the mainstreaming. And there governments can play a crucial role and also give security, not only de-risking, first loss guarantee, but also putting forward this as a political high-level thing, really putting sustainability in all its form, economic, social, and environmental in a balanced way, putting this forward. So de-risking, transition, creating. We are working at the moment, for instance, not only on a national level, but also on a local level, working with the transition movement in order to educate people, to take people by their daily choices. And so it has lots to do about consumption, about change, And transition means quickly changing things. So there we can play a really crucial role.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we really ran out of time to drill in some of the other questions that have been raised, but fortunately, you will see in your program now, there are 4 now sessions that, and when I look through them, don't have to repeat them now, you can see them in the program, but a lot of them actually touch on exactly some of the questions that were raised here. So I think it's a really nice transition. Logistically, what you need to do is you need to, one of them will take place here, the other 3 will take place in other rooms. There is a GLF team and signposts outside that help you to find the room. We are running 2 minutes behind schedule already, so I would urge you just to make your way as quickly as possible so we can start them. But before you do that, I would really like to give a round of applause for the panelists. I think it was a fantastic panel. Thank you very much.